what Wesley Yang calls the successor ideology. I call left modernism, as you know. And I think it's a blend of two things. One is a cultural form of socialism in which you are going to equalize by race, gender, and sexual identity group. You're going to, you're targeting, you're going to overthrow the patriarchy and white supremacy. So it is a kind of cultural version of the left, but allied to that is this idea of modernism, rejecting tradition, social construction, all identities are fluid, all that, that sort of whole postmodernist type discourse, which is very linked to this notion of the new, the different, always rejecting tradition. That kind of
So like to just interrupt, so again,
yeah,
it's interesting to think about the difference. So when I studied the early civil rights movement, I think about the first aspect of that. There was an aspect of we're going to overthrow this sort of the white male culture, or change it, or at least change the identities of people, diversify the elite. But it was in the context of like the early EEOC, for example, didn't think about women's rights. They thought about getting black men jobs, for example. They had the sort of the same patriarchal assumptions that society always had, and that lasted for like 5 or 6 years before the women's movement took off in the late 60s, early 70s. And so that's like that's I guess that's which one's liberalism, which one's
but
modernism?
those would, I think those would all still be kind of cultural socialism. So they're
Oh
about
yeah, that's what I'm saying. That's what I'm saying. So
equalizing
that's the
between
culture.
identity
Yeah,
groups. Might have been race first, then gender. But
yeah.
what I'm talking about is actually more the sort of sexual revolution, divorce, decline of religion, people living alone, this sort of
And
expressive
that's yeah.
individualism.
And
That
that's different from
expressive,
getting women and minorities to the jobs. That's like you imagine the
yeah.
world staying the same. You just add more women and you add more blacks to like Fortune 500 companies, and otherwise, basically, you have the same moral values. Is that sort of the difference? And then the next thing is like sort of it adds this. Okay, everything is fluid, everything is weird. Fat acceptance. Are these like sort of the two underlying ideas?
Well, I think, yeah, I think that to put it simply, the left idea is about equality and harm prevention, let's say, to particularly totemic groups around race, gender, sexuality. The sort of it's more political. It's about redistribution of power, destroying power structures. Whereas the modernist thing is arguably just more purely cultural, where it is about the new, the shock of the new in art, for example, modern art. Comes in the early 20th century. It's about alternative forms of living alone, being single, not being sex before marriage, not being religious, rejecting tradition. Doesn't necessarily need to be left. You even had certain right wing forms of modernism. And that, if you look at the Beats and groups just prior to the 60s, they might have been pretty male chauvinist. They weren't necessarily focusing on these great ethical projects. It was much more about expressing your inner true self without being encumbered by bourgeois social mores and artistic conventions. And you're just going to break with all that because you want to be liberated. And it's a different thrust from
Yeah, I
wanting to
see.
protect people from harm and to equalize power and all
So
this
you
sort of
think
stuff.
Great Awakening? You think Great Awakening is the first thing? It's the equal. It's more equalizing identity, and this LGBT stuff is related, but it's more of the cultural. It's broader,
I
and it's
think it's
less.
kind of it's an offshoot of that whole expressive revolution, the sexual revolution, expressive revolution, the breaking of boundaries, not for power reasons, but more just for I want to be free, liberated type reasons. That sort of thrust. Now, of course, it's never entirely separate. There is always a kind of political angle to it, but let's just say it's distinct enough that you could get relatively unpolitical types of people like non-college educated African American, for example, who might just soak up this culture from the wider, celebrity from social media, whatever. And so I think that's, if I were to say, I think that's probably what's going on. But I would say on campus, there's an extra layer, which is an explicitly political, hey, I'm LGBT, because that's also sticking it to the patriarchy or to some kind of established political structure. But one thing that is the case is that the university educated are not, if anything, they're less likely to be LGBT than the non-university educated. So it doesn't fit necessarily a purely political type of explanation.
Yeah. The So I guess one way to look at it is sort of like the Trump movement is a little bit like it's not a left, but it is compared to say conservatism before it. A little bit more of a transgressive thing. So I don't know if you've seen Lady MAGA, this trans individual, this who goes around is like, oh, I'm Lady MAGA, but it's like born a man, and like she got into a fight. I mean, he, she, whatever goes by, got into a fight with like Nick Fuentes on Twitter, and there was a video of
Oh
it saying like you don't belong in the get out of the Trump movement or whatever. And it's like, but the Trump movement does like the Christian conservatives of 30 years ago would not have accepted such a person. While the Trump movement does accept and accepts Trump himself, who's been divorced twice before. And so that's so this is like it's the transgressive thing, and sort of MAGA. It's like this own the libs sort of shock. Let's go, Brandon. This profanity and this sort of crudeness of it all. That seems like that's progressive, but not left. It's not interested in equal representation of women and minorities. Right?
yeah.
So
Well, you of course these things are complicated, right? It's just like you can be left. If you go back to pre-World War I, the Marxist left would look at the NAACP and go, that's really bourgeois. We don't want any part of that. Of course, we want to have more advanced groups into the country because they're going to bring the socialist revolution, and these other groups are going to retard it. So you can have different kinds of left inconsistencies, but then you can also have with modernism too. You might have like radical innovation in the technological sphere or in one, as you mentioned right there, in certain areas, but then you could still have traditionalism. And I think, what the Trump movement is to some degree a traditionalist movement. If you look at his speech at oh God, I'm trying to remember when he was talking. What's that mountain where they Mount Rushmore? He did his Mount Rushmore speech, and he very much invoked the defense of tradition against people who are going to take down statues and who are going to attack American tradition. So he is defending against the modernist thrust is very much to break with tradition, to tear things down. So he is kind of anti-modernist in some ways, but in other ways, as you say, certain innovations he might be classed.
I guess it's a compromise. It's a compromise. The Trump movement is maybe some kind of compromise with modernism. It's like, okay, critical race theory. We'll have like, so Trump had he had a thing where when they were liberals were tearing down all these statues, he had a thing where he was going to start like a hall of heroes or something where they were going to have like all these statues of people in American history. And it's like, it's funny. I looked at the list and it's like, there's a lot of affirmative action going on. It's like a lot of women and, non-whites who maybe weren't important in American history. And so like, you have this sort of compromise where it's like, you're still going to say America is the greatest country in history, and you're not going to like be too explicit with the anti-white stuff. You're not going to like critical race theory. You're not going to encourage gender transition, but at the same time, it is sort of a compromise. Like it will accept some kind of affirmative action, and so it's like I guess this is opposite of what I was saying, because that sounds like I was saying the Trump movement is more modern, less left. But that sounds like sort of anti-modern, but more left. So yes, it's very complicated.
I mean, I think if you go back to the Bush brothers and the fusionist establishment republicanism that was about the religious right, so the religious conservatism, family values, school prayer and not teaching evolution, all these sorts of things. I mean, that kind of social conservatism is certainly not the major force in Trumpism. Trumpism is a break from that kind of conservatism. That's not to say Trump isn't supported by evangelicals, but if you look at what he's pushing, it's not the Office of Faith-Based Initiatives and the kind of things George W. Bush was pushing. It is much more. And of course, that religious conservatism was very universalist and missionary, and it was about Christian Zionism and all these other foreign policy things, right? And that's kind of out of fashion. And so I think I always say Trump is much more of a European style conservatism, much more recognizable to Europeans, whereas the older kind of fusionism would be completely alien almost, except in a few places like Ireland or Poland. So yeah, Trump represents that kind of more secular nationalist conservatism.